When you play the Game of Thrones, you
Subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
All right, hello YouTube. Welcome back to the Grease Cobb YouTube channel. Today's video, we're going to be picking up on another retrospective. Over the last few months, I did A Feast for Crows, and as much as I enjoyed doing that book, I wanted to do A Dance with Dragons as well, as it is the closest book to A Winds of Winter. It's also a book that I think is interesting to study, given when it was released, things that were going on during this point. Why is this release so interesting, given the context of the book, and how you may look at it differently if you put it into the context of George R. R. Martin and his writing style, its release day in terms of when was the last time we had seen these characters, why does the story format in a certain way, especially early on. And so let's take a look at A Dance with Dragons. A Dance with Dragons came out on July 12th, 2011. About 6 years after the release of A Feast for Crows and 11 years past A Storm of Swords. So in a lot of regards, we had not seen characters like Daenerys, Jon Snow, Tyrion, Davos, Bran, a lot of our major characters that we had come to love for 11 years. And when you put that into context, think about it like this. Us waiting for Winds of Winter right now is a comparative length of time of reading those certain characters, right? So again, it's a bit different because Feast for Crows came in that time, so we still had A Song of Ice and Fire content, but your favorite character more than likely probably was not in the last book. So you hadn't actually seen your best characters, your favorite characters, in a very long time at this point when this book was coming out. So let's also think about it from this point of view. And so I want you guys to think about this if you are a Song of Ice and Fire fan. Within a couple months of each other, during the first season of A Game of Thrones, as it would premiere on April 17th, 2011, and would broadcast the entire first season, getting to the release of A Dance with Dragons. So A Dance with Dragons, in a lot of ways, was on a high, right? Because people were reinvigorated to get back into their favorite characters, but also Game of Thrones, its popularity now, it wouldn't reach its popularity in the first season, but it would garner a lot of that interest back. The first season is loved by many people. It's one of the best seasons of the show. And so it really would have drawn all those fans that were still waiting for the series right back into this series. And so A Dance with Dragons had a lot of hype around it, in my opinion. Now, was I someone that was reading this book in 2011? No, I was 11 years old. So I would not have been reading this when it came out. But I want to think about it from this point of view of Dany, Tyrion, Jon are back. Three main characters are back. Game of Thrones Season 1 has just come out, along with the rest of the series that's going to be coming out as well. It was well received, the first season, in this regard. Everything was looking really up. And so we get into A Dance with Dragons. And that leads us to, does this book pay that off, right? Is this a good book? Is this a bad book? What is this book? And when we get into this retrospective, I'm going to talk about it in a lot of ways. This book has a lot of ups. It has a lot of downs, right? It's almost the polar opposite of A Feast for Crows in its structure. A Feast for Crows has a lot more minor characters. It has a lot more of the plot lines in the background that were happening almost off screen or building up to off screen in A Storm of Swords. And then they kind of explode in A Feast for Crows. There's a lot of reactionary things that happen because of things that happen in A Storm of Swords. A Dance with Dragons is almost no different. But think about the comparison between A Dance with Dragons and Winds of Winter. The beginning of this story in A Dance with Dragons is going to be a lot about reminding the audience what happened, right? It's been 11 years since we've touched a lot of these plots, but that'll get us into the first chapter of the book with Varamir. Now, I will say right away, I think of the 5 openings of the main books, this is my least favorite. It is a lot of, and why I say that is because, in my opinion, it does the least in terms of the entire world. Like, when you look at Pate is a really interesting POV into our first look at Old Town. He is going to connect to a bunch of different plot lines, whether that be Arya, whether that be Sam, whether that connects to future stuff with like Morrowind and things like that. He also gives us kind of a fresh perspective, the common person and how the corruption of this world works, which I find very interesting, and also going on that really awesome idea of the heart in conflict. This is not that. This is very much a POV that is focused solely on really one plot line in this book. You could argue 2, but I would say it's really just for Bran. And this is a very interesting way to start out a book. If you look at all of the main POVs that people do not like, Bran is by far the least entertaining POV, I think, for most people. And so starting out the book with a POV that is directly correlating with Bran is interesting. And so to me, I don't like it too much because it's just straight up, it's warging, right? How does warging work in this world from somebody that's other than Bran? We haven't seen warging too much in this world when it comes to how does it work? What is its powers? What are the rules to it? And so a lot of this is setting up Bran. It really makes us think about Bran quite a lot and how we think about the character, because when you think about what you shouldn't be doing, right, as your animal, it really relates to Bran, because we've seen Bran take the mind of another human in Hodor. That's a big no-no. We're going to see Bran eating a man's flesh through a wolf. Kind of a no-no once again. So there's a lot of no-nos that we're seeing through Bran. So this chapter makes us, in a lot of ways, recontextualize the way we think about a character like Bran. But let me talk about it a little bit, a brief summary of what happens in the chapter. So we're introduced into this character of Varamir, who is a skin changer like Bran, but just a very powerful one. And he is fleeing the Battle of the Wall. This is taking up directly after Stannis had come through and won the battle for the Wall. We see the rest of the wildlings that had survived and how they were falling back. Some were going to the east and some were just dying off, right? These are people that struggling to find food, struggling to find warmth. And it's a lot about this desperation, Varamir trying to live on. And it's seeing that, again, the others are still a huge threat north of the Wall, and really establishing why the wildlings came south to kind of begin with. And again, personally, it's almost a reminder chapter for the Jon plot line, but it's a big plot. It's a big POV to set up Bran, and it does it pretty well. Like, I won't say, like, this chapter does well for what it's trying to do. I just don't like what it's really trying to do that much. I think there's a lot of other POVs that would have been more interesting to start this book with, other than Varamir. And so to me personally, I was not a big fan to the way this book starts. Now, I will say, another thing I want to mention here, because when I looked at A Feast for Crows, I think George R.R. Martin took a step back and realized some of the issues people had with A Feast for Crows. Because one of the things I talked about with A Feast for Crows that's so different than this book is going to be, is A Feast for Crows, George R.R. Martin takes a lot of leaps. He kind of front loads a lot of the newer plots, right? The Greyjoy plot and the Martell plot are almost completely front loaded into the first half of the book. And so when you look at that book, the way it starts, it's, you have Pate, you have, I think it's Aeron is second, and then Areo Hoda. You have 3, newer POVs people are just not going to care as much about until you get to Cersei, who is chapter 4. This book does not do that. This book jumps right into the characters that people were wanting to read, and it starts in probably the best way. I think everyone wanted to see what Tyrion was going to be up to after that stuff that happens in Storm of Swords. How is he going to be affected as a character? What is his plot going to be looking like as the story goes forward? And so we get to Tyrion 1 as the second chapter of the book. And I think Preston Jacobs sums up this chapter perfectly. In a lot of ways, it is just a catch-up chapter, trying to remind us what happened in the last book, and now catching that up to how is that affecting Tyrion now? We see Tyrion as this character he's defeated in a lot of ways. He's gone straight to alcoholism. He is questioning if he even wants to be alive at this point of the story. It's a really interesting psychological dive into what Tyrion is going to experience in this chapter. And Tyrion is a character that I think is a tale of two stories. I think I really like him in the first half of the book, and the second half of the book, he's not so good. I like Tyrion when he's interacting with characters that are interesting to the story, that can either outwit Tyrion or make Tyrion use his wits or have some bigger relevance to the plot. And so seeing Tyrion try to figure out what Illyrio Mopatis's motivations are is quite interesting, because we as the readers also don't know what Illyrio's motivations are. Again, remember, the last time we really see Illyrio is in the first book with Arya. And so we've heard about Illyrio here and there, right? We know that Barristan was sent to Dany through the help of Illyrio, but we don't know what game Illyrio is playing at this point, right? Because the plan doesn't really go well, right? The Dothraki are supposed to come over with the Targaryens and start a war, right? But that is kind of up for suspicion here in this chapter. It's already brought up, like, why is Illyrio helping Dany? And it just isn't for profits. And Tyrion kind of notices that. So I like the back and forth between the two characters. But again, this chapter is pretty dark. It's a lot of Tyrion dealing with his trauma, drinking himself nearly to death, and being as pessimistic and awful as possible, whether that's interacting with Illyrio's servants, whether that's interacting with Illyrio as well, whether that's Tyrion interacting with himself, the way he kind of beats him up or things like that. All of this makes perfect sense into the psychology of Tyrion, and I know a lot of people have an issue with the way Tyrion is in this book, but it's completely natural. It's the way Tyrion should be as a character. And so that old Tyrion, which again was still Tyrion, right? Tyrion is still Tyrion. It's just because of the events that have happened, he has leaned into that darker side of Tyrion that's always been there. Alt Shift X makes a really good video on the real Tyrion Lannister, and one of the things he really talks about that is he looks back at a lot of the moments of especially a Clash of Kings and some of the things that Tyrion did that were quite awful, whereas us the audience were rooting for Tyrion, but they are quite awful things. He leans into more of those things, especially in this book. Again, I noted here that I think a lot of people dread Tyrion and some of his earlier chapters because it is a lot of a recap, but I personally really do enjoy Tyrion 1 and 2, and even, again, I like Tyrion really from here all to the Young Griff stuff, and so I don't have a big problem with Tyrion at this part of the book. I also do like, again, him playing the Game of Thrones with Illyrio, and I also like the reveal at the end of Tyrion going to Dany, which again was obvious. Like, I feel like anyone reading Tyrion, or even, let's go back in time. Let's say after Storm of Swords, there was, YouTube wasn't really a big thing then, but if there was, I think if people would have been making prediction videos, it would have been obvious that Tyrion was going to help Dany. That would have been an obvious prediction. So this isn't like this huge, big reveal, but it is something that George needed to establish, right? Give Tyrion that focus, right? The big focuses of this book for Tyrion are going to be getting to Dany, and 2, his character, right? Is he going to lean further into that darker side of Tyrion, or will he find some sort of atonement? Will he find some sort of higher purpose to bring him out of that state? And that's really what Tyrion 1 is all about. Again, that gets us into the 3rd chapter of the book, Dany 1. So again, Dany 1 is another one of these chapters that it's really a lot of a catch-up, but I will say, this just really goes to prove that George does listen to feedback. He does understand what things people don't like in previous books and is willing to adjust accordingly. Because think about it. The first 4 chapters of this book are Varamir, which again, it's the first chapter of the book. You knew it was going to be a different POV, right? So you give him a pass there. But then 2, 3, and 4 are Dany, Tyrion, Dany, and Jon. The 3 POVs everybody wanted to see. And so I think that is not a coincidence. George understood what he wanted to do. And I want to get this out of the way right away, because very similar to Tyrion is that Dany has a stigma, especially for this book, that she's just pretty meh in this book. And I can see where that is coming from. But personally, I do like Dany in this book. I think she goes on a different journey and George puts her in a very uncomfortable situation. Whereas Dany, her whole life after book 1 has kind of been this conqueror, this person that is trying to gain power then to go to Westeros. And we have this big reveal in book 3 that she's not going to do that, right? She's going to try and rule. And so she's going to struggle with that. She's never ruled anything before. Even back in, book 1 or book 2 or all these things, she's not exactly ruling over a place, right? The Dothraki, yes, she has some sway over Drogo, but she's not the person in charge of everyone, right? That is still Drogo. Here, it is her. She is the one making the decision. She is the one that, if the society fails, it's on her. And so she's dealing with a lot of different things. And so George sets this up all perfectly in this first chapter, because we have to see what is Dany's goal of this book. What is George going to do in this book for the character? And so we have the Sons of the Harpy creating issues for Dany. And this is very interesting right away, because In the past, Dany has gone against other forces, right, in battles and sieges, but she's never fought a war of a shadow war, more or less, of people being killed in the streets. How do you find these people? What motivates people to give you information to track them down and kill them or imprison them? Dany has never had to deal with that. And that's going to be something that's very relevant to this book for her as a character. But again, we see that an unsullied man has been killed. It is interesting because we see that Dany's rule is far from secure and establishes right away the central theme of her arc. How to rule something that she has not really done before, right? How is she going to deal with different personalities like Reznak and the Shave Pate? How is she going to deal with a culture that's very different from her own? We have seen her integrate into other cultures like the Dothraki, but she's struggling with the ways of the Marinese. The Marinese are slaver people. That was built upon their roots, or the past, 100 years or so. How do you change an entire society's culture in a blink of an eye? How do you do that? Right? Because if you even think about, again, I'm American, so I like to reference United States history quite a lot. How do you go from a point of slavery to everyone being free? How does that work? How do you get groups of people that have been against each other for a long time to reconcile and integrate into that culture? And we're still seeing some of those divides even now. But going into the story, think about that. It's very difficult because you have some people who might have had a better life in slavery, even though slavery isn't evil. They themselves benefited from slavery, which is an interesting dilemma for Dany to overcome, because Dany realizes, and us, the audience, agree with Dany that slavery is bad, but what do you do when someone tells you they would rather be enslaved? It's an interesting dilemma that Dany is going to have to go through in this book. But what this chapter does is set her up for the future. How is Dany going to deal with personalities like Varys and Littlefinger? Things that Robert had to do. This is really a lot of that prelude to what Dany will have to deal with in Westeros. And it's a lot of kind of that training. It's a building book for Dany. But we see her sitting the throne, giving advice to multiple people or on issues like the Yunkai and the fighting pits, and eventually ends with Dany's worst fear, her dragons killing a child. Again, this is great because it plays exactly on what Dany is going to have to overcome. Outside of all the politics going on, her trying to rule, she also has to deal with her dragons. Her dragons are getting bigger. They're growing more fearless and violent. What does she do with that? And we're not going to figure out what she does instantly. That's going to come in the next chapter, but it poses an interesting question for Dany. Is she still in control of them? Obviously not, because they've killed a child at this point, something that Dany's not really had to worry about up to this point. She has to now realize how dangerous they are, and that is a really awesome way to build a Dany's chapter. I think Dany's first chapter is obviously better than Tyrion. Dany's is more focused. It's not about as much as like figuring out and telling on what happened in the past and how that works now, but her chapter is not as much a catch-up chapter. It still is, but it kind of gets right to the point. It really focuses on exactly what her POV is going to be about. Whether you like that or you don't like what her POV is about in this book, I like that George is direct with this character, and we understand right away there's no dilly-dallying about what her POV is about. All right, so getting into Jon 1. Jon 1, I think, is very similar in a lot of ways to Dany 1. It's really about exploring, again, what happened in the past, so where are we at this point of the story? But also it's about just establishing where this character of Jon is going to be, right? This chapter follows Jon dealing with Stannis and the issues of trying to please a king who saved them while also trying to stay neutral. Because, again, if you're in the Night's Watch at this point, you're in a very precarious position. You don't want to be seen as helping Stannis, because if Tywin and the Lannisters rule, that's not a good look for you. You want to be able to get as much aid from them as possible. You're in a very sorry state. So you have to deal with how do you manage those different personalities. We also see, again, a lot of this chapter also focuses on Stannis. This is almost a like POV into Stannis as a whole, because we see that Stannis is struggling to gain support in the north. He has sent Davos to treat with White Harbor, but again, if we go back to Feast for Crows, we know that that doesn't seem to have gone well, or at least something happened to where Davos is presumed dead. So that is a play that Stannis is trying to do. But we also see that Stannis is not garnering much support from the northern houses as a whole, as the Mormonts have now recently turned him down and White Harbor has gone silent. But Stannis also talks on the fate of Mance and how he will be burned, which also Jon is not a big fan of either. Jon has kind of come to respect Mance quite a lot, and burning is not a good way to go. It's probably one of the worst ways possible to go out. It's not a painless death. It's you are in pain for quite a while and then die. And so Jon kind of sees this as a stupid, because you can use Mance in a lot of ways to control the wildlings more if he's alive than if he's dead. And that's something that we even see that I think even Mel realizes as well, but at this point that's not the case. But Stannis wants to reinforce the castles on the wall with his own men. Again, Stannis is seeing this as the Night's Watch has all these castles, but none of them are manned. So Stannis thinks, okay, let's man these castles. Let's get the wall to be strengthened. But that runs into a problem, because these castles are not Stannis's to do so, right? These are the Night's Watch's castles. They stay neutral. That is not allowed. And Jon says that, right? He refuses this, only allowing that his officers be in charge. If Stannis wants to give him men, fine, but he will have the men that will be over them. And this frustrates Stannis, right? Stannis, in a lot of ways, this is a frustrating time, right? The North is not rallying to him like he would have hoped. He is not getting as much as he would require from Jon as he would like after he believes he saved them, which he did. But he's, again, a very precarious position for Jon, and this is going to encompass a lot of the early part of the story for Jon. How does he deal with people like Stannis and Mel? But Mel follows him and warns him of foes behind his back and daggers in the dark, and quotes a line from Ygritte, he knows nothing. Again, it's a great open, because in a lot of ways this chapter is just a refresher for the Jon plotline and the Stannis plotline, which will be heavy focuses of this book. But it also kind of is foreboding for the future, right? We already have this foreshadowing of Jon's death. We see that Jon is someone that is struggling to play politics, to be a leader, and also getting this very cryptic line of Mel knowing Ygritte's famous line. All very interesting, and also kind of peels back some of that wound that Jon still has for Ygritte. Again, it's been quite recently she died. So again, just something that would get under Jon's skin a little bit. But that gets us into Bran I, Chapter 5. Now, something I want to point out. Bran is a character that I think we give a lot of criticism towards. He's probably one of the worst POVs of the entire story, in my opinion. But I will say, at least his first 2 chapters in this book are pretty good. I have them ranked pretty nicely. I'm kind of doing it differently this time than I did for Feast for Crows, where I'm ranking them as I read them, so it's a little bit more fresher in my mind on how I want to rank things, instead of just ranking them all at the end based on my summaries and what I can remember from them, so try to make it a little bit more fresh. But I really enjoy this first chapter for Bran, because it adds a bit of tension to their story, because I feel like a lot of the problem with Bran's chapters are there's not a lot of conflict, or there's not a lot of tension. It just kind of feels like we're wandering around. This chapter is not that. This chapter is focused. We need to get here, but how do we get to the cave? We are struggling, right? And again, it picks up on the ideas of who is the three-eyed crow, who is Cold Hands. That's a lot of this chapter's focus. When you look at my video talking about who Cold Hands is, a lot of that information comes from this chapter specifically. A lot of this chapter's focus is on who he is, and he is not of the living. But again, this chapter is filled with intrigue and mystery. This chapter almost directly correlates with the Varamir open to the story. And again, that's one of the reasons why I don't like the Varamir one, because I feel like it's almost a connection to one part of the story and really none of the others. But it's really apparent here, because we see Bran continuously going into summer, taking more and more time out of his body as he's just being lugged around and not much is happening while they wait for Cold Hands to come back with food and things like that. And we also get this disturbing description of how Bran is going into Hodor, who does not like the process. Again, it makes you question Bran. And it's a lot of foreshadowing to maybe things that will come to the future, but it's very weird that Bran is going into Hodor's skin a lot, and George even takes the time to describe, very similar to Varamir's first chapter, how Hodor is very uncomfortable with this process, and Bran is basically overpowering Hodor's will and taking over his body and mind. That is very scary to think about, and if Bran grows more powerful, what is that going to have on the effects of the story? What will he do with that? Again, people have kind of thought up, because of the show, Was Bran someone that went into other people's minds? Was Bloodraven doing this in the past? Was he going into Aerys's mind? That's why he went insane. Maybe he was trying to give him warnings, but instead it was something that drove him mad. That's all very interesting to think about when you look at the future of the book series, things that we could look at going back to the past and how that could possibly be affecting the world. At this time, we also see that Summer interacts and takes over the pack that we saw in the prologue of Wolves. So again, just Bran asserting his will and dominance, which again, very interesting to see as well. But we see Bran and Summer's body actually eating the Night's Watchman. And this is very key because in a lot of ways, Bran is once again doing something he shouldn't be doing. He is eating man flesh in his wolf's body. That is not good. That is cannibalism, more or less. Because eventually we also see that Cold Hands comes back to the group saying he slaughtered a pig, which is highly doubtful. Think about the way Varamir is described as there's no food around in the first chapter. We even our group here, they're not finding much food to eat. And you think about it and you go, wait a second. There was just some people that were killed. The wolves were eating them. And now, all of a sudden, it seems that Cold Hands has found some food. So it's very much led for us, the audience, to believe that, yeah, they probably went to some cannibalism here. So Bran, again, eating other humans, not good. And so there's a lot of intrigue, a lot of things we can look to speculate on the rest of the story. But again, really good opening chapter for Bran that I really do enjoy. That gets us to number 6, or chapter 6, Tyrion II. So Tyrion II is definitely not as good as Tyrion I. I think there's much more interesting stuff between the two characters of Tyrion and Illyrio, whereas this one, it's a lot more of a travel chapter. It's more about giving us the histories of Essos, or where they are specifically in Essos. It's more to establish where Tyrion is going to be going in the future. Again, it is explained at this chapter that Tyrion will travel with a man named Griff to deliver him to Dany. But already this seems fishy. This kind of seems fishy because Illyrio notes that the Golden Company have broken a contract, and we get a famous line here that it doesn't matter what the dragon is, red or black, as long as they can go home and it's a dragon. That is a very interesting line that does not seem to add up with the history of the Golden Company. And that already is going to get the wheels kind of turning for us, the readers, as to what is Illyrio actually up to? Because we're going to get more of this in the 3rd Tyrion chapter, but that's very fascinating because we also get more into Illyrio's backstory as well here. But again, we get to some interesting lore about Essos and the political climate, but the more interesting points is about Illyrio and Varys' past, how the two operated, how they interacted. It really paints the picture of why Varys has become the person that he is, but we also get his ex-lover, in which Illyrio still has her hand. And could this be a Blackfire? That would make a lot of reasoning as to why young Griff A would be a Blackfire and why Illyrio loves him so much. That's a really interesting point. And this, again, Tyrion connects with about his past in Tysha. Again, the two can connect on their really flawed pasts when it comes to love. And that gets me to, I think, probably my weakest chapter of the first, 200 pages of the story. And I've talked about this a lot. I'm not a Quenton guy. I just do not like this character. I don't really feel like he provides much to the story. I think if he's a lot like Sam to me for A Feast for Crows, where I think if we just skip Quentin's journey and have him be brought up when he meets Dany through Dany's POV, that would be completely acceptable. I just don't feel like this is needed. But let's talk about what the first Quenton chapter does and maybe what things I just don't really particularly like about this storyline. Again, this chapter is a main focus on Quenton, who he is as a character. And again, he has been keeping his identity hidden and is on a mission to reach Dany and marry her. Again, all of this is self-explanatory. We already knew this from the Already On chapters in Feast for Crows. So really, it's just bringing that to the table for us, the viewers. As many people probably didn't like the Dornish, as I know there are people that didn't like a lot of the more minor plots like the Dornish plot, and so George wants to refresh the reader onto what is going on here. But to me, it's just nothing particularly interesting happens in this chapter outside of, okay, our crew with Quenton realize they're going to have to become part of a sellsword company to get to Dany, because there's not really a good way in which they can get to her, because Slaver's Bay at the moment is a very dangerous place to travel to. We get some interesting things here and there that during their passage, some of their companions have already died, one of them being a maester, which was very detrimental to them. But they are, again, struggling to find passage to Meereen because of the war breaking out. They are stuck in Volantis for the time being. Again, they attempt to get passage from a smuggler, but this seems like a very bad idea, as it seems like they're being fooled and it's unlikely to actually end well. But either way, on their way back from the docks, they encounter some windblown looking for recruits, and the party realize this is their only option to get to Dany. Again, personally, I don't really care about Quenton. I don't find his character that interesting. He's just another failed love interest for Dany, really. And I think his death, if he is dead, I believe he is dead, other people do not, his death will have more meaning on other characters, like Arianne, like Duran, and some of the moves that they go forward with. So I feel like Quenton is not exactly his own character. He's more a character for other characters like Daenerys, like Barristan, and like the other Dornish I've talked about. And so this character just comes off as flat. Like this chapter, by far, of all the chapters we've gotten so far, is the least impactful. Like, this chapter didn't need to be here, right? Like, what is the difference between getting Quenton with Dany later on in the story, and Quenton just goes, yeah, I tricked the windblown, and I ended up, traveling to you just so I could be traveling to you, and then getting the big reveal that, Viserys was supposed to marry Arianne, but now he is going to marry her. That's going to be how they're going to do the deal. And all of that. I think that works the exact same, except it gets rid of some of this fluff and or filler that I think Quenton has in this book. But that gets us to Jon II. Now, Jon II is very interesting because it's a flip of Sam 1 in A Feast for Crows. And I mentioned this a lot when we did that chapter in the last book. It's an interesting take of how to do this, because something that chapter really does well for Sam 1 in Feast for Crows is it shows, like, why is Jon making these decisions? It makes us, just like Sam, questioning Jon. And so even in that book, one of the big things that it builds up for the story already is Jon is someone that is really isolating himself from his friends. He is not making people like him and or respect him as much as they probably could. It's leading people to question him because his communication skills are not the best. And so I love the way George flips this. So in this chapter, we can actually see a lot of what Jon is doing, and we understand his motivations, albeit I think that he could do things a little bit better and explain things better. The whole chapter is really the focus of Jon killing the boy and becoming the man. He is trying to make some moves that he believes are not going to make him well liked, but are what needs to be done for the greater good. Again, we see Jon commanding Gilly to take Mance's child, and Sam is forced to go south with Aemon. And again, it's a hard chapter to look at because we know all this stuff is going to happen and what it ends up leading to, right? Like, we know because Aemon goes south, that ends up getting him killed. So in a lot of ways, Jon is responsible for Aemon dying, even though Aemon kind of dies more of natural causes than anything. It's interesting to realize this stuff with hindsight of looking at what Jon's decisions are going to lead to. And we can understand Jon's rationale perfectly. We understand that this baby is going to die if Gilly does not take him. We know that they need more maesters. Sam needs to become a maester. That's for the greater good, to find more about the others. We know that Aemon needs to go south or else he might get burned, and that's something Maester Aemon does not deserve. And so we understand all of Jon's decisions, but still, it's hard to read because these are hard things that he's isolating all the people that we care about a lot and are Jon's staunchest supporters. But at this, we get some of my favorite parts of this. The rest of the chapter, again, the second half, focuses on some of the forts remanned and repaired as best as possible. But this leads to a great payoff. And it's really awesome for me because I'm just now reading, I'm getting to that section in the Game of Thrones reread where Janos Slynt is coming into prominence. He's betrayed Ned. He's just gotten Harrenhal on Tuesday in the video we did with Sansa 5. He is finally getting his comeuppance. And so Jon basically gives him an order and he refuses it. And watching Jon figure out how to deal with Slynt and executing Slynt is fantastic because we see Jon once again, he is not a boy anymore. Lent is pleading, saying he's a coward, and Jon still kills him. And one of the best scenes that they executed from season 5, from the book to season 5 anyway, is this scene. And we see again Stannis' nod of approval at the end of the chapter. It's kind of that nice little cherry on top. And by far, it is my favorite chapter of the first 9. It's just a big moment for Jon's character and for the story as a whole, something we've been waiting on for a long time. So Tyrion III, again, chapter 9 gets us to meeting young Griff and getting to that party and getting away from Illyrio. Tyrion, again, he is done with Illyrio. And so in this chapter, he meets Halden and Duck. We get some nice little nods to the Blackfire theory. Again, as Illyrio is gifting many things to young Griff, and makes us think about, wait, how come Dany and Viserys did not seem like they got any of these things? Only Dany seemed to get a lot of these gifts, and that was because she was married or marrying Khal Drogo in the first book. But the three travel to the ship, having conversations about the Shrouded Lord, which is also very interesting, given some theories about this could be Tyrion's uncle, which is also very interesting, and how Duck was knighted by Griff, because this is very interesting as well. We now know that Griff must be a knight, and there's not many knights in Essos. So all of that's very fascinating because it's going to get the gears turning for Tyrion. But all this is very interesting, but the best part is him meeting young Griff and eventually Griff, because Tyrion sees a lot of his father Tywin in Jon Connington, which is interesting given that Jon Connington wishes he had been more like Tywin. He could have ended Robert's rebellion. And so a lot of this is very interesting. It gets us into, I think, the best part of Tyrion in this book. And I think the first 3 Tyrion chapters are all solid. I don't think any of them are spectacular, but they are good enough to get the job done and really get us to, I think, really the peak part of Tyrion in this book. So moving on, we get Davos I, and this is, again, it's a prelude. It's really a prelude to the amazing chapters we're going to get going forward with Davos in this story. But again, it's a reflection chapter. It's really what it is. It's reflecting and piecing together what happened between A Storm of Swords during the timeline of Feast for Crows and here. And so we see that because of storms, they have shattered Salador San's fleet, and Davos has been left stranded in Sisterton. Davos has been captured as he was trying to smuggle his way to White Harbor, but is caught. Again, this is going to directly reflect what happens to Ned in Robert's Rebellion, something I talked about in a past video as well, but this is interesting, right? Because how is this going to work with the Lord here, with Lord Burrell? How is he going to deal with this situation? Right? But Lord Burrell and Davos have a conversation about what to do with him, and we get some interesting information about the history of the sisters. Again, as I talked about earlier about the Robert's Rebellion stuff, it's a direct comparison to what's happening here. Stannis, albeit maybe isn't in the best position at the time, who's to say he doesn't actually end up gathering the North? If he was to defeat the Boltons, that'd be a huge win. Rallying the North behind him, who knows what could happen? Tywin is dead, right? That's something that Davos finds out in this chapter. Tommen, at this point, is on the throne with really bad counselors. We see how all that plays out in Feast for Crows. And so, yeah, there's something that Lord Burrell really has to think about. But we also not only get the Robert's Rebellion stuff, we also get the kind of the history of the Sisterton and the sisters as a whole, as how the Vale of the North would constantly fought over it until it was eventually brought into Aegon's kingdom. But overall, this chapter is a great chapter to build on for Davos. George is really just showing us what happened with Stannis in this book, building up this plot line, and giving us a taste of what is to come in the North with Davos. So that gets us to Jon III. And I want to point this out, right? We are only 11 chapters in, and we've gotten 3 Tyrion chapters and 3 Jon chapters. Half of the first part of this like little section is just Jon and Tyrion. If that doesn't show you that George took the advice of readers in the past, of his fans and his readers about the criticisms of A Feast for Crows, this should tell you everything, right? If we even think about the next chapter, right? Out of the first 12 chapters, 8 of them are Jon, Dany, and Tyrion. I just want to point that out as we go further in here. But Jon III, again, I really praise what George is able to do with this character, because this is just a really great chapter. I love everything that it has relating to Jon. Again, his plotline in this book is really established by these first 3 chapters, but the chapters open with Mance Rayder's execution, or what we believe is Mance Rayder's execution. And this is a really big moment, right? Mance Rayder has been built up as a really big character at this point of the story. And so, again, hindsight, we know that this is a Mance Rayder. But given what we know at this point of the story, this is a big moment. Like, this is really Jon's, I wouldn't say his villain of his arc, because that's the others, but it's been like his anti-hero of his story. And so a really big character is going out, and we see Mel performing this ritual, but we again see the way Jon and Stannis handle things quite differently. Jon is not willing to let this man be burned to death and commands him to be shot with some arrows to, again, just allow that to end quickly. Now, this is not actually Mance Rayder, so it is quite different. But it is quite interesting. But something else we're left to ponder here is that Mance Rayder starts saying that he was not the king and that he wasn't all these things. That leads you to think about this. Is this just one desperate plea for Mance Rayder to get out of this? But no, we know this is really the Lord of Bones yelling this because he doesn't want to get burned. It's very interesting. What also does this tell us? It tells us that Mel doesn't really believe that king's blood is needed because it's the Lord of Bones. It's not the king. And so we've kind of already realized this by the time we get to Winds of Winter, but it's not really king's blood that does it. It's blood in general. It's blood magic that's powerful. That's what gives power in this world. We also see more of why Jon is killed as he continues to try and struggle with ruling and dealing with people, because at this point, Bowen Marsh does really respect Jon, but Bowen suggests he block the gates, but Jon disagrees, doesn't really express why. Like, he just says, oh, it'll leave us blind, but he doesn't really expand upon that. It just feels like a one-sided conversation where Bowen Marsh is, giving all these reasons as to maybe why this could be beneficial, and Jon just going, nah. That's kind of how it feels. And like, we as the readers understand why Jon doesn't want the gates to be blocked because we're in his head. So we're looking at his thoughts and going, yeah, I understand that rationale, but he's not saying those things to Bowen Marsh. And so when you have a building conflict, right, where Bowen Marsh is going to have a lot of these moments, and a lot of people in the watch will have these moments with Jon where they're giving him some sort of idea that Jon doesn't like, but Jon doesn't really give them anything back. He just says no. And so that's an interesting point. But we also see that the wildlings are basically given a choice. You either bend the knee and get some food and shelter, or you're basically told to leave. They can go back up north with no clothing, or well, with the clothing that they have, but no food really. Basically a death sentence. And so many do bend the knee to Stannis and all of that and get food and things like that, but it doesn't really go the way I think Stannis was kind of hoping it would. And so at this point, right, this is why Bowen Marsh is like, we need to close the gates, right? Because the wildlings are going to come back. If we seal the gates, it'll be much easier to defend. We don't have the men to defend against another assault like what happened with Mance. And that's a very interesting point, right? Like, if you think about it, like if you think about Bowen Marsh's rationale, we know the others are out there. We know the wildlings are out there, and they're going to be coming south. We know all of this. What is the point of having scouts? What's the point? Right? The last time that they went on a really big scouting party in book 2 didn't go well. A lot of the Watch's strength died because of Mormont's decision. Now, it was important to understand what was going on, but at the same time, it was also detrimental. So again, you can see both of the rationales of both Mormont and Jon Snow, which is what makes this chapter so interesting. But not only that, we also see this chapter having some internal conflict about the wildlings and the Night's Watch relationship, right? How is Jon going to circumvent that? But also, how is, when he looks at his Night's Watchmen and how they react to the wildlings, a lot of them are not too pleased. A lot of them are not happy to have all of these wildlings south of the wall. It makes them feel uneasy. And if you're a Night's Watchman, think about this. For thousands of years, you've had these issues with the Night's Watch and the wildlings, right? And so a lot of these people don't have those experiences with good wildlings, right? Or people that are just normal people trying to make their way to safety. They don't have those relationships. A lot of people have lost friends to these wildlings, or maybe even if you are living in the north, family members. All of that is very relevant to this whole argument that's going to go on with Jon and the other Night's Watchmen. But we also see Jon struggling with being a leader. He has regret over Gilly, Aemon, and Sam as he hears of the storms that occurred in Sam 2. Again, if you guys don't remember, there was a big storm that happens that ends up basically having them struggling in around Skagos. It's a really filler, one of the worst chapters of A Feast for Crows, but that is what Jon is kind of referring to at this moment. But he also knows he can't be friends with his men anymore and goes a step farther. So yeah, we see Jon basically going to the dining area, and his friends want them to sit with him. And Jon is about to, but then he thinks this. Like, he thinks about how Ned always told him he can't be friends with his men, right? You can't do that because you may have to send them to die or basically be sitting over them if they commit a crime. And so Jon goes a step further. He has all of his staunchest allies, people that we have known from book 1, and sends them away, either to Shadow Tower or Eastwatch. And it's another misstep from Jon. Because what does this do? It isolates his staunchest supporters, people that would be able to understand him more, and sends them other places. And all in all, again, it's a great chapter that really is a culmination of Jon's entire arc in this book and foreshadows much to come. And that'll get us into chapter 12, or Dany II. Again, I think it's another really good chapter because just how I talked about with the last 2 chapters for Jon, this is a really good one. It's a direct continuation of the issues built up in the first Dany chapter. We see more deaths have occurred with her Unsullied being slain by the Sons of the Harpy. Again, one of which is actually a brother to Missandei. Doesn't really happen in the show, but again, this is a very big event. Missandei is much younger than she is in the show, and so this really impacts her. But we see how Dany deals with the Sons of the Harpy and what lengths she will go to get information, right? She goes as far as having these witnesses that who knows if they're innocent or actually guilty, but possibly tortured by the Shave Pay because she's that desperate for information. Again, you see those glimpses of things that George can play on in Winds of Winter, where it's like Dany in her desperation sometimes can make bad decisions even if she thinks it's for the greater good. But other things that I find are very interesting in this entire situation is how Dany, again, is not really asserting herself. She's playing more of a passive role, which is much more different for her as a character than we've seen in the past. But Dany then has to be the one to confront or comfort Missandei and struggles with how can she protect her people, right? How is she going to protect all these people that are calling her mother, right? There's this really cute line where Missandei calls Dany basically her protector and her mother. And Dany struggles with that. She feels guilty because she has the weight of all of these people's lives, but yet people are still dying. But this also makes her think about her real children, the children that she has always said as being her dragons. The dragons have been imprisoned and how they have failed to capture Drogon. Dany is feeling an overwhelming sense of loss of control. She feels like she can't handle this whole situation. And again, what do we always talk about? It seems like when Dany is at her lowest point, her weakest point, she's either having dragon dreams or being visited by Quaithe. And this is by far the most interesting part of the chapter because we always use this section of this chapter to foreshadow things to come with Dany's plotline. But we see Quaithe appear, and it comes at a very interesting point as Dany is in many ways losing her way. Quaithe tries to remind her to be a dragon and remember who she is, but also to warn her of people to come like Tyrion, like Victarion, like all these other people, like young Griff possibly. But she also has once again to deal with the growing issue of the reopening of the fighting pits. Again, Hizdar has brought some of these pit fighters, and what's very interesting is that the pit fighters want the pits to be reopened. This is where they get glory. They feel like they have some worth in this world, and Dany doesn't know what to say to them, right? It's the same idea that we talked about in Dany 1, where slavery is definitely a bad thing, but what do you do when there's certain people that are enslaved that had better lives because they had better masters when they were enslaved than they do now? Now they're, looking for bread and not being able to live a normal life. How do you deal with that? And that's the issues that Dany is trying to come to, is like, how does she deny the people the fighting pits if that's what they want? That is a very compelling issue to play with the character of Dany. But lastly, again, like we talk about, whenever she's at her weakest, she goes to her dragons. She goes to see them, but she has to think of what to do. They are no longer children, but in her words, they are monsters. She has to recounts how she had to deal with a farmer after in Dany 1, she had to attempt to buy his silence as Drogon had killed his child. Again, Dany is locking up her dragons, right? She believes they're too wild. She can't control them anymore. She's losing her way, right? She very similar to me with like a character like Robb, who as the story goes on at times seems to become very disconnected with his wolf Greywind, and that's something that's very detrimental, right? Because he's kind of going away from his Stark instincts and going away from who he is. That's something that Dany struggles with in this chapter, and why I think it's a really good chapter for Dany, because it plays on her identity, her growth in this character, a lot of her struggles and things she's dealing with. It's all going to culminate into the end of this book, that this chapter is pivotal to understanding that. Now, we get to chapter 13, which is Bran II. Now, Bran II is a really, really awesome chapter as well, right? Like what I talk about with Bran is he's really good at the beginning of this book. We see, again, picking up from where we left off, Bran and our group has been traveling, and this is the most desperate they've probably ever been. The cold is getting to them. Many of them haven't eaten in days, and they're struggling to reach the cave. You can see it. It's in sight. They're finally there, but it's this tough uphill battle. And I mean that literally. It's going uphill. It's hard to walk. And even some of them can't even walk anymore. Even Jojen himself cannot walk any longer and is having to be helped by his sister. Even to the point where they really are kind of left behind. As Cold Hands notes, the others are approaching and even the wolves are close by. They must hurry. So him, Hodor, and Bran hurry to the entrance. But before they can get there, they are run upon by the others. It seems a trap. The others come from the ground, pulling Hodor to the ground, but also having Bran fall from his basket. It's a really intense scene in which our characters seem like they're about to die at many points, but it all leads to, once again, the question of Bran warging into Hodor. And again, we see that ethical issue as Hodor doesn't like it, but Bran sees it as he must do it or they are going to die. Bran, using Hodor's body, allows them to survive, again helping Mira and the others. But at this point, they are saved by the Children of the Forest, something that's been foreshadowed really since the first two chapters of Bran's story in A Game of Thrones. But either way, they are led through this really weird area where it seems like there's these deep white roots that they think are snakes at the beginning. They come across skulls of things like ravens and such. But at this point, they find Bloodraven. And this is a really interesting point, because Bran at this point asks if he will walk again, but Bloodraven says no, he will fly, which gets Bran to the point of crying. He's gone on this insane adventure, abandoning, the North, his family, and coming to this point just so that he could not be a cripple anymore, which has haunted Bran from the beginning of the story and is one of the biggest reasons why he came to seek out the Three-Eyed Crow. At this point, that's kind of been crushed. This seems as a lot of manipulation by Bloodraven to get Bran here, so that who knows what could happen. If Bran is basically becoming a vessel for the old gods, who knows? But it comes off as very strange, and a chapter that will start Bran's arc as becoming probably the Three-Eyed Crow, or at least some sort of vessel for them. It puts a lot of tension and unease and huge twists for Bran's story, and is by far one of his best chapters of his entire POV throughout all 4 books that he is in. And again, it's a definitely standout chapter of the opening story. So thank you guys all for watching part 1 of my Dance with Dragons retrospective. I hope you guys all enjoyed the first part, and I'll hopefully be getting to the second part within the coming weeks as well. Let me know if there's anything I didn't talk about that you think I should have, and let me know what your guys' thoughts are on A Dance with Dragons. Let me know, out of the 5 books, of the main series anyway, where is this one ranked? But bye guys.